My in-laws left me at home with Callista, my mute sister-in-law, while they jetted off to Hawaii for vacation. Just before leaving, my husband Bowden turned to me and said, "It's your job to look after her. Don't slack off." However, the moment they were out the door, Callista stunned me by sitting up and announcing, "All right, let's get moving too." I'm Amy, 27 years old. When I was younger, I harbored grand dreams of becoming a pop star. But reality set in, and by my late 20s, I'd already let that goal slip away. I met Bowden through a mutual friend and started dating him, mostly because my mom wouldn't stop pestering me about when she'd get to become a grandmother. Bowden and I clicked right away, especially after discovering that he'd also once dreamed of making it in the entertainment world. Nowadays, Bowden has a solid career at a prestigious trading firm in Manhattan. As for me, I used to work at a bank after college, but I left that job after we got married. One day, we went to visit Bowden's parents. That's when I got to know his younger sister, Callista. She had suffered from encephalitis as a child. What started as a seemingly harmless fever turned out to be much more serious. By the time the doctors identified it as brain inflammation caused by the flu, the damage was done. The fever had led to brain injury, leaving Callista unable to speak and bedridden. Since then, her mother had taken on the role of her main caregiver. Oddly enough, Callista and I formed a bond from the very start. Although she couldn't speak, she communicated using sign language. Over time, I picked it up naturally. I remember once jokingly signing to her, "We're like best friends," and she gave me the sweetest smile in return. "We've known each other forever, right?" I playfully signed to Callista. She smiled warmly and signed back, "Yes, let's stay close friends forever." My heart melted as I eagerly responded, "Of course, we will." Unlike Callista, however, my mother-in-law was a completely different story. She was critical and sarcastic, always finding ways to put me down. Bowden and I live in a condo about 30 minutes away from his family's house, but that didn't stop my mother-in-law from showing up unannounced. Every visit turned into an opportunity for her to nitpick. "Look at Bod's shoes. They're a mess. Don't you know that a man's shoes reflect his professionalism? It's your responsibility to keep them clean," she would scold. Strangely, she always referred to him as Bodney, as if he were still a child. She had a list of rules she expected me to follow. Fold the laundry perfectly, or Bodney will get upset. Never go to bed before him, even if he tells you it's fine. Her words constantly rang in my ears. When Bowden and I were dating, and even in the early stages of our marriage, he was sweet and attentive. If I wasn't feeling well and suggested eating out, he would immediately agree. If I hinted at wanting a designer bag, he'd surprise me with it a month later. But about a year into our marriage, things began to change. Bowden began to act differently, or maybe this was who he truly was all along. He started coming home late, reeking of alcohol, and claimed he was swamped with work, even on weekends. What puzzled me most was that he stopped asking me to join him when he visited his parents' house. It felt strange and out of character. One evening, I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. "Bowden, you've been so distant lately. You hardly talk to me anymore, and it feels like you've changed," I said, trying to hold back my frustration. He paused, glaring at me briefly before responding in a cold tone. "That's not true. You're just overthinking." But I wasn't convinced. "I don't think I'm overreacting," I said firmly. "Something is different, Bowden." His reply was curt and dismissive. "Stop bringing this up." With that, he walked away, leaving me standing there, overwhelmed by confusion and pain. So, when Bowden suddenly announced one day, "I'm going to my parents' house this Sunday. What are you planning to do?" I was caught off guard. For months, he had been going there without me. I quickly asked, "Can I come with you this time?" He let out a sigh before replying, "That's why I'm asking." Despite his lack of enthusiasm, I jumped at the opportunity. "I'd love to. I've really missed Callista." Bowden didn't seem particularly happy about my excitement, but I didn't let that deter me. I caught a faint grimace on Bowden's face when I mentioned his sister. "Yeah, you and Callista seem to get along really well, huh?" he said, his tone unreadable. "We do. It feels like we've been best friends forever," I replied, hoping to ease the tension with a light-hearted comment. On Sunday, we made the drive to his family's home in Nebraska, stopping at a bakery along the way to pick up some pastries for his mom. She was always difficult to please, but pastries usually softened her mood. When we arrived, Bowden's mom greeted us at the door. The smile on her face vanished the moment she saw me, replaced by a displeased scowl. "Mother-in-law, I brought some pastries for you," I said cheerfully, handing her the box. She opened it, peeked inside, and remarked in a dismissive tone, "Oh, these again? They're getting boring. But if you insist, I'll have them." Her demeanor changed instantly when Bowden spoke. "Is father here?" he asked. Despite being well into his senior years, his dad was still working. "No, he's at a meeting."
"Why?"
"Did you need something?" his mother replied. "Not really, just had something I wanted to talk to him about," Bowden said casually. "Curious," I chimed in. "What did you need to talk to him about?" Bowden turned to me with an irritated look and said, "It's none of your business." Shocked, I protested. "What do you mean? We're married. Of course it's my business." Before he could answer, his mother interjected, her tone sharp and condescending. "Exactly. If Bowden doesn't want to share something with you, stop prying." Realizing it was pointless to argue with her, I stayed quiet, swallowing my frustration. When Callista appeared at the doorway. She lit up at the sight of Bowden. "Oh, Bowden, you're here," she signed with a smile. Out of nowhere, Bowden surprised us by suggesting a family trip to Hawaii. "How about you, sis?" he asked Callista. She shrugged and signed. "I'll pass. I don't have a passport." I was taken aback by the sudden proposal. Bowden was always so consumed by work, so it was odd to hear him planning a vacation. "Bowden, is everything okay at your job?" I asked, still trying to make sense of it. He shot me an annoyed look and replied, "Everything's fine." I wouldn't suggest this if work wasn't going well. As usual, his mother couldn't resist chiming in. She gave me a sharp glare and said, "You shouldn't interfere in Bowden's decisions. You're being far too nosy." Then Bowden dropped the real reason for the gathering. "Actually, Amy, the reason I brought you here is because I want you to take care of Callista while we're on vacation." For a moment, I was stunned. But as the idea settled, I realized that looking after Callista at home sounded far more appealing than enduring a trip with my overbearing mother-in-law. "Okay, I'll take care of Callista," I agreed, though it stung that Bowden hadn't even thought to include me in the trip. "But you didn't need to bring me all the way here just to say that," I added, unable to hide my irritation. Bowden shrugged. "Well," he said, "I figured it was easier this way." "If I told you in front of my mother, you'd be less likely to argue," Bowden admitted. It was clear he anticipated my frustration about being excluded from the trip and had counted on his mother's support to keep me in check. The realization stung. It felt like they had planned this together, leaving me little room to say no. Feeling cornered, I decided to let it go for now. After the conversation ended, I went to Callista's room. She was lying on her bed, but lit up the moment she saw me. "It's been a while. How have you been?"
She signed.
"I'm good," I replied in sign language. "Bowden asked me to come over today, but it's strange. For months now, he's been visiting without me." Callista's expression turned serious. "My brother is always hiding something. He's never been the type to share openly," she signed back. Then, with a casual shrug, she mentioned the family's upcoming trip to Hawaii. "I'm staying behind, though," she added, flashing a grin that made it clear she wasn't bothered in the slightest. We spent the next hour chatting, and I found myself enjoying her company as always. Callista's warmth and humor stood in stark contrast to her mother's critical nature, and I often wondered how they could be so different. Just before I left, Callista gave me a sly wink and signed cryptically, "I'll tell you soon." Her words lingered in my mind, hinting at something I couldn't quite figure out. Fast forward to the day of the Hawaii trip. Bowden and I went back to his parents' house. While the rest of the family was busy packing for their flight, I was getting settled in for my week-long stay with Callista. I carried my luggage to Callista's room, and she greeted me with an excited glint in her eyes. "It's happening," she signed, her grin playful and mischievous. I couldn't help but smile back, though I wasn't sure what she meant. When I returned to the living room, Bowden's family was bustling about, getting ready to leave for the airport. Bowden's voice rose above the chatter as he addressed me. Taking care of Callista is your responsibility. Don't slack off, he said firmly. His mother, never one to miss an opportunity to criticize, chimed in with her usual sharp tone. Make sure you and Callista get along. Honestly, it's better for you to stay here anyway. Then she added something that made my blood boil. If anything happens to Callista, it'll be your fault. We'll hold you accountable. The audacity of it all left me speechless. They were happily jetting off on vacation, leaving their disabled daughter behind with me, and yet they had the gall to place all the blame on me if something went wrong. I bit my tongue, refusing to engage, and walked back to Callista's room, eager to escape their self-righteous attitudes. The moment I stepped inside, Callista surprised me. She sprang up from her bed with an energy I had never seen before. Come on, let's get going, she said, her voice breaking the silence I had long accepted as normal. I froze in the doorway, my mind struggling to process what I'd just heard. What? Was all I could manage to say, completely shocked. Callista chuckled, amused by my reaction. I told you, I can actually walk. And talk too, she said casually, as though it was no big deal. When? How? Since when? I stammered, still in disbelief. Since last year, I think, she replied nonchalantly. Why have you been hiding it from everyone? I asked, my confusion giving way to curiosity. With a calm expression, Callista began to explain, her words hinting at a bigger story. Actually, there's something you need to know. You don't know this, Callista began, but my father and mother are both remarried. I'm my dad's child from his first marriage, and my brother and sister are from my mom's side. Suddenly, so much fell into place. Her mother's coldness, the way she was treated like an afterthought, a burden. It all clicked. I had a feeling, I admitted quietly. Callista gave a small nod. Yeah, she continued. Mom can't stand me, and I didn't want to deal with her constant bitterness, so I pretended I couldn't walk or talk. But Dad knows everything. He's always had my back. As I tried to process this bombshell, Callista dropped another one. That's why I've decided we're going to Hawaii too. What? I asked, utterly baffled. You mean today? Yep, she replied with a mischievous grin. We'll even be staying at the same resort as Bowden and his family. I stared at her, trying to wrap my head around what she was saying.
Wait.
I'd love to go with you, Callista, but do you even have a passport? Of course I do, she said confidently. I secretly got it last month. And don't worry about money. Dad's taking care of everything. Our flights, the resort, even your ticket. I was floored. I see. I guess we're really going to Hawaii then, I said, still in disbelief. And just like that, the plan was set. Callista and I packed up and headed to the airport, embarking on a journey that would change everything. That's how we ended up where we are now, side by side, ready for an adventure in Hawaii. Callista and I took a taxi to the airport, and when we arrived, her father was there waiting to see us off. Amy, I know this might be overwhelming, he said kindly, but I hope you enjoy the trip. Thank you, I replied, still trying to process everything. I feel bad that you're covering all the expenses, though. Don't worry about it, he said with a warm smile. As long as you two have a great time, that's all that matters. We boarded our flight, making sure to travel on a different airline than Bowden's family, and landed in Hawaii early the next morning. The breathtaking beauty of the island immediately lifted my spirits. We checked into the resort, where Callista and I shared a room. Both of us were practically buzzing with excitement for the days ahead. As we unpacked, I casually remarked, "Your father seems to have traveled a lot." Callista nodded.
He has.
He's been on countless international business trips, even to Hawaii a few times. So, what's the plan? I asked, eager to know what she had in store. Callista smirked, a mischievous glint in her eye. I'm betting my mom and everyone will be dining at the resort restaurant tonight. I think it's time for a little surprise. I chuckled, already intrigued. That sounds like a blast. But we should get some rest first. This jet lag is no joke. Callista sighed in agreement. Good idea. I couldn't sleep at all on the plane. With that, we settled in, anticipation bubbling just beneath the surface as we prepared for whatever surprises the evening would bring. After showering, Callista and I climbed into bed, both of us falling into a much-needed sleep almost instantly. When I finally stirred awake, the late afternoon sun was already streaming through the window. It was close to 4 o'clock. Callista was up and sitting at the mirror, applying makeup. Sorry, I slept too long, I mumbled, feeling groggy. No worries, Callista replied with a smile. I just woke up, too. We both needed the rest. Now we're fully charged and ready for battle. By 7 o'clock, we were gearing up for Callista's planned surprise. I'll head down to the restaurant to check things out first, I told her. She nodded. Be careful and don't let them see you, she said with a smirk. I made my way downstairs, carefully staying in the shadows near the entrance of the resort restaurant. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, searching for Bowden and his family. Then I spotted them, seated happily at a table in the far corner. As I edged closer to get a better view, something unexpected caught my attention. A young woman sitting with them. I didn't recognize her. She hadn't been at Bowden's parents' house when they left, and the sight of her made my stomach twist. I squinted, straining to hear their conversation, and caught fragments of what Bowden and my mother-in-law were saying. I'm glad it's not that woman tonight, my mother-in-law muttered, her voice laced with disdain. I nearly gasped aloud, my mind racing. What was going on? Who was this woman, and what did my mother-in-law mean by that woman? My heart sank as I tried to piece it all together. I really drew the short straw with her, I heard Bowden say, his voice laced with contempt. She's tainted our family. I want to divorce her and start over, he continued. I'll find a reason and squeeze every penny I can out of her. My mother-in-law chimed in without missing a beat. Even if you don't have a solid reason, we can fabricate one. She's such a terrible match. Honestly, I wish we could just throw her in the trash. Their words felt like daggers, and the bile of betrayal rose in my throat. It was clear they were planning to get rid of me, to cast me aside like some unwanted burden. And all the while, they celebrated with this mysterious woman sitting at their table. I fought the overwhelming urge to storm into the room and confront them. Instead, I turned on my heel and retreated back to our room, my heart pounding with a mixture of fury and heartbreak. When I walked in, Callista immediately noticed something was wrong. That took a while, she said, watching my pale face closely. What happened? I saw something shocking, I whispered, my voice trembling as I tried to process what I had just witnessed. Bowden, he brought a woman I've never seen before, and they were talking about divorcing me. Callista gasped, her hands flying to her mouth.
What?
That's awful. I nodded, a strange calm settling over me. For the first time in months, I felt clarity. Honestly, I said, surprising even myself, I feel relieved. Now that I've seen him with someone else, I know there's nothing worth saving. I'm ready to move on. I can finally divorce him, I said with a sense of liberation. Callista grinned. That's a good thing. So, shall we go make our entrance? With a mischievous glint in our eyes, we headed down to the restaurant. Once there, we requested a table near Bowden's group. The hostess seated us close enough to overhear every word. They were still engrossed in their conversation, throwing insults about me as if I weren't even a person. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at their audacity, marveling at how endlessly they could badmouth me. Callista caught my eye, giving me a subtle nod, our signal to start the counterattack. Taking a deep breath, I stood up and marched straight to their table. My voice rang out loud and clear, cutting through the hum of the restaurant. Are you all having a good time? The look on Bowden's face was priceless. His jaw dropped in sheer shock, while my mother-in-law's eyes widened in disbelief. For a moment, they were completely frozen, like characters in a paused movie. Finally, my mother-in-law found her voice, breaking the silence with a sharp demand. What are you doing here? And how is Callista here without a wheelchair? Callista stood up with a calm, yet confident smile. I don't need a wheelchair anymore, she said, her voice steady and composed. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as her words sank in, leaving Bowden and his family scrambling to process what was happening. Bowden and his mother stared at Callista, their expressions frozen in disbelief. Thanks to you, Callista said with a sharp, cutting smile. I've regained my ability to walk and talk. I must have caused you so much trouble all these years, but don't worry. I'm fine now. When did you start talking again? My mother-in-law stammered, her face growing visibly pale. Maybe about a year ago, Callista replied casually, as though discussing the weather. Why didn't you tell us? Bowden asked, his voice trembling with shock. Because it was easier for me if you all thought I was still mute, Callista said bluntly. And, besides, I heard what you were saying about Amy. My mother-in-law's face turned ghostly white. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling as she tried to backtrack. We weren't saying anything bad about you, Amy. Oh, really? I said, pulling out my phone. Because I recorded everything. Would you like to hear it? Bowden's face twisted with anger, his composure cracking. Amy, you've caused me nothing but trouble, and now you're making these ridiculous accusations. I met his fury with cold determination. Once we get back, I said firmly, I'll be contacting my lawyer to start the divorce process. And you can't deny what I've recorded. The color drained from his face, his bravado faltering. For the first time, it seemed Bowden and his mother realized they were backed into a corner, with no way out. You've done enough, I said, my voice steady but filled with anger. You're on vacation with another woman, plotting to divorce me. And let's not forget, you called marrying me a bad lottery ticket. So, I fully expect you to compensate me for that insult. My mother-in-law, realizing the gravity of the situation, suddenly tried to backpedal. Amy, dear, she said with a forced smile, I've always liked you. Let's not make rash decisions. We can work this out with Bowden. That woman doesn't mean anything to him. But I wasn't buying it. I'm sorry, I said firmly, but I can't stay with a man who sees me as nothing more than a bad lottery ticket. Enjoy your time with her, and don't be surprised if I seek compensation from her too. The other woman, who had been quietly shrinking in her seat, now looked pale and terrified. She fidgeted nervously, clearly regretting her involvement in this mess. Bowden, desperate and panicked, fell to his knees. Amy, please, he begged, his voice cracking. Don't make a big deal out of this. My company has strict policies. If they find out, I'll lose my job. I shook my head, unimpressed by his sudden display of humility. You don't sound sorry at all, I said coolly. This isn't about your job, Bowden. This is about your complete lack of respect for me and our marriage. He looked visibly shaken but wasn't ready to give up. I'm begging you, he said, his voice filled with desperation. Please forgive me. I'll fix this. I promise. I stared down at him, unmoved by his pleas. You should have thought about all of this before, I replied icily. You are married, yet here you are in Hawaii with another woman. Actions have consequences, Bowden. His pleas faltered as the weight of my words sank in. For the first time, I felt the power shift, and I wasn't going to let it go. I will never forgive you, I said with finality, my voice cutting through the tense air. Upon hearing my harsh words, my mother-in-law crumpled to her knees beside Bowden, tears streaming down her face. Please, Amy, forgive my son, she begged, her voice thick with emotion. By now, the entire restaurant had turned its attention to our table. The scene we were making was impossible to ignore, and the manager was already making his way over to intervene. I stood up, determined to end the spectacle. Callista and I will head back to our room now, I said coolly, looking directly at Bowden and his mother. You all enjoy the rest of your Hawaiian vacation. I suppose things will get a little more complicated when you return home. Bowden, now openly sobbing, shouted, Please forgive me. I can't afford to pay any compensation. His desperate outburst drew a deep frown from the restaurant manager. With a quick word to a nearby staff member, the manager turned back to Bowden. Sir, he said firmly, you're disturbing the other guests. I'll have to ask you to leave. Still in shock, Bowden didn't seem to comprehend what was happening. Moments later, two large security guards arrived. Without much effort, they hauled him out of the restaurant, ignoring his incoherent protests. I turned to Callista, who was watching the scene with an amused smirk. "Let's go," I said, feeling a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. Together, we left the restaurant, leaving Bowden and his mother to face the consequences of their actions. Bowden was dragged out of the restaurant, his cries and struggles no match for the security guard's strength. Left behind, my mother-in-law and the other woman sat frozen, their faces painted with a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. Callista and I exchanged glances, both surprised at how far the situation had escalated. Still, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing Bowden face the consequences of his actions. In my mind, he had gotten exactly what he deserved. A week later, Callista and I returned home. I learned that Bowden had been released shortly after being ejected from the restaurant, but he'd spent the rest of the trip in a daze, keeping to himself. It didn't bother me in the slightest. The day after I got back, I visited a law firm where a friend from college worked. Unfortunately, my friend wasn't available, but I was introduced to a female lawyer who immediately put me at ease. I recounted everything: the infidelity, the lies, and the deeply hurtful comments Bowden and his family had made. She listened intently and then reassured me. "Divorce is absolutely possible," she said. "And given the circumstances, you have a strong case to claim alimony from Bowden." Her words were a balm to my wounded heart. She also mentioned investigating the other woman Bowden had been with in Hawaii to determine if I could seek compensation from her as well. A month later, the lawyer contacted me with news that would change everything. It was proven that Bowden had been seeing the other woman for about 6 months, which opened the door for me to claim alimony from her as well. Without hesitation, I told my lawyer, "Please get as much alimony as you can from both Bowden and that woman." She smiled confidently and gave me a reassuring nod. 2 months later, the divorce was finalized. Not long after, a significant amount of alimony from both Bowden and his mistress was deposited into my account. As I stared at the sum, I couldn't help but mutter to myself, "Well, that's karma for calling me a bad lottery ticket." 3 months later, an unexpected knock came at my door. When I opened it, there stood Bowden and my mother-in-law. Both looked gaunt, their faces hollow and worn, as if life had drained every ounce of their former arrogance. They had lost a noticeable amount of weight, and their once confident demeanor was completely gone. I cracked the door open just enough to keep my distance and asked coldly, "What do you want?" "I have no desire to see either of you." Bowden's voice was weak, almost a whisper. "I'm sorry, Amy," he began. Could you lend me some money? I lost my job, and the woman she left me. I don't even have enough for food." His mother, looking equally defeated, chimed in softly, her tone pleading. It was a stark contrast to the condescending way she used to speak to me. "I've divorced my husband too," my mother-in-law said, her voice trembling as tears streamed down her face. "I'm broke. Please, Amy, we're begging you." Her display didn't stir an ounce of sympathy in me. I crossed my arms, standing firm. "Too bad," I replied coldly. "I have absolutely no obligation to help either of you. And even if I did, I wouldn't lift a finger. Now leave." They stood there, stunned into silence, before shuffling away, defeated and broken. Watching them retreat, I felt nothing but relief. After they left, I went to my kitchen, grabbed a large handful of salt, and sprinkled it across the doorway. It was a small, symbolic act to cleanse my home of their lingering negativity. As the salt hit the floor, I felt lighter, as if a weight I'd carried for far too long had finally been lifted. This was it, the final step in closing the door to that toxic chapter of my life for good.